When 27-year-old Francesca vanished during what was supposed to be the ultimate solo road adventure, an ambitious cross-country motorcycle tour, authorities quickly assumed the worst. Their immediate conclusion pointed to a tragic accident somewhere along the perilous switchbacks of Colorado's towering mountain ranges. In those first crucial days, her parents clung to that theory like a lifeline. They scoured countless canyons, combed steep cliffsides, and pored over maps marked with every potential route she could have taken. Each season that passed drained a little more hope from their hearts, but they never stopped searching. Not until 6 years later, when something unexpected was retrieved from the waters of the Rio Grande, an item that turned every assumption on its head and dragged the investigation into a much darker, more disturbing direction. The first sign of trouble was subtle. An inconsistency, a barely noticeable break in what had been a carefully maintained routine. To the Sullivan family, who lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood just outside of Philadelphia, the late summer days of August 2018 had a rhythm to them. A comforting ritual had taken shape ever since Francesca embarked on her journey across the United States. Every evening, without fail, she would send either a text or place a short call home. It was her unbreakable promise, one that was not up for discussion, especially after her parents had expressed their concern about her traveling alone on a motorcycle. She had spent over a year planning every detail of her cross-country expedition. It wasn't a spontaneous whim. It was a well-researched, extensively mapped dream. On August 23rd, the first day they didn't hear from her, Francesca's absence was met with calm reasoning. Her mother, Eleanor, offered a simple explanation. Francesca had entered the heart of the Colorado Rockies, a place where cellular reception was famously unreliable. She was probably setting up camp in a remote basin or high-altitude meadow, completely off-grid. Mark, her father, nodded in agreement, though an unsettling feeling had already taken root in his gut. Francesca wasn't the type to overlook details. She had been raised to anticipate problems and plan accordingly. If she expected a dead zone, she would have warned them. Day 2 brought more than unease. It brought dread. Every call they made to her number was met with a mechanical voice telling them the call could not be completed. Their texts, once answered with emojis and cheerful updates, remained unread, marked as undelivered, and suspended in digital silence. Eleanor became a prisoner of her phone, opening and refreshing her daughter's social media pages over and over, searching for some new sign of life, some flicker of recent activity. But the feed stood frozen. Her last post was now 3 days old, showing no signs of the woman who had previously posted vibrant photos daily. At first, their conversations had been filled with hopeful rationalizations. Maybe she just needed a break. Maybe she was unplugging for a few days. But those excuses quickly lost weight. By the morning of August 25th, the third consecutive day of silence, their denial crumbled. The absence was no longer explainable. It was terrifyingly loud. This behavior simply didn't match who Francesca was. Her adventurous spirit didn't make her reckless. Quite the opposite. She was methodical, mature, and aware of how deeply her parents worried. She had spent years riding along the East Coast, navigating winding mountain roads and dense forests. She knew how to handle herself, and above all, she knew not to let her family panic. The journey was about discovering America on her own terms, not disappearing from it entirely. The last trace she left behind was a photograph, a single image that now felt almost sacred. Sent to her mother's phone just hours before all communication ceased, the photo captured Francesca bathed in sunlight, her face tilted slightly toward the sky, eyes gleaming with happiness. Her lips stretched into a beaming smile, teeth flashing in the crisp mountain light. Perched on her head, a pair of sunglasses held back wind-blown strands of her thick brown hair. She wore her distinctive blue and black armored jacket, built for safety as much as style. And there behind her was her motorcycle, her pride and joy. A sleek red BMW Sport touring model, its back loaded with black waterproof duffel bags, every strap secured with practiced hands. The backdrop was surreal. Behind her stretched a panoramic vista of snow-capped peaks, rising like jagged teeth above a glacial lake, shimmering in an unnatural shade of turquoise. It looked like something from another world. The accompanying message was simple but electric with joy. Made it to the top of the world. Unbelievable. Love you. At the time, Eleanor had cried happy tears. That message felt like a triumph, a gift from her fearless daughter. Now, it felt like a haunting goodbye. It was the last known signal from Francesca, a final pin dropped on the vast, wild terrain of Colorado. By the end of that third day, Eleanor and Mark could no longer pretend everything was okay. Fear had overtaken hope. Mark called the local authorities, dialing the Hinsdale County Sheriff's Office in Lake City, Colorado, a town nestled deep in the San Juan Mountains, close to where they believed Francesca had taken that photograph. He described the situation to the dispatcher in a voice steadied by necessity, though the strain was evident. He explained the sudden disappearance, her usual reliability, and the text that now felt ominous in retrospect. He gave them Francesca's full name, her date of birth, and details about the motorcycle she had been riding. He forwarded the last selfie and accompanying message, hoping it might help narrow the search area. That phone call marked the official beginning of the investigation. A case number was issued. Francesca Sullivan was no longer just missing to her family. She was now a name in an active missing persons file. Back in Colorado, the case landed on the desk of Detective David Miller, a seasoned investigator with over 3 decades of experience handling disappearances in the region. His modest office, lined with faded maps and case folders, overlooked the very mountains that had enchanted Francesca. Miller, with his leathery skin and steady eyes, had seen his share of tragedy. Most of the cases he handled involved hikers, campers, or hunters, people who'd wandered into nature and failed to return. He knew these mountains could be merciless. He also knew that time was the most precious commodity in any search. A lost person's chances of survival diminished drastically after 72 hours. Still, he held on to the possibility that Francesca might be hunkered down somewhere, injured or stranded, but alive. He began the way he always did, by creating a detailed timeline. His first objective was to reconstruct her route, every gas stop, every scenic overlook, every trailhead she might have visited. If she had left digital breadcrumbs, he was determined to find them. While the emotional core of the case had already been firmly established through Francesca's final photograph, Detective David Miller needed something less sentimental and far more tangible. His investigation would hinge not on feelings, but on hard data, undeniable, time-stamped facts. Within the first 48 hours, Miller had already submitted urgent formal requests to both Francesca's cellular service provider and her financial institution. He was after the digital footprints that modern life inevitably leaves behind. Unlike human memory, this trail wouldn't blur or embellish. It would offer cold, impartial precision. The first to arrive were her banking records. The details were mundane, but painted a clear, logical picture of Francesca's westward progression. Her transactions revealed a breadcrumb trail of fuel stops, small grocery purchases, and a few rest stops along her journey. Nothing out of the ordinary, until it abruptly stopped. The last transaction recorded was a $15.72 charge at a gas station just outside Lake City, Colorado. The timestamp read 11:42 a.m. on August 22nd. That specific data point instantly became Miller's anchor, the final proven moment when Francesca interacted with the world in a way that could be documented. Next came the cell phone data, and with it, a more complicated narrative. The last successful communication sent from Francesca's device had been the photo message to her mother. Bright smile, clear skies, joy radiating from her face. That message had gone out in the early afternoon of the same day as the gas station purchase. Afterward, the phone records were a bleak series of failed connection attempts, all initiated by her desperate family. But one detail stood out: a single passive ping from her phone that occurred in the early evening on August 22nd. It was not a call, not a message, just a brief automatic handshake with a cell tower perched high on Slumgullion Pass, one of the highest and most remote mountain roads in the region. When Miller mapped the tower's signal range, he drew a wide cone that covered nearly 300 square miles of some of the most inhospitable, jagged terrain in the continental United States. It was both helpful and overwhelming. They had a geographic boundary, but it was massive and uncooperative. Somewhere within that slice of wilderness, Francesca had vanished. That region included the Alpine Loop Scenic Byway, a network of narrow, often dangerous jeep roads that snaked through Colorado's remote high country. The pass, surrounded by cliffs, pine forests, and glacial valleys, was notorious even among experienced off-roaders. Beyond the loop were dozens, perhaps hundreds, of unmarked Forest Service trails. Any of them could have led her into isolation, and if she'd misjudged one turn, if her bike had slipped on gravel or ice, she could have plummeted down a ravine, hidden from sight by thick foliage or jagged rock. The scenario seemed increasingly likely. A tragic accident. That was still the leading theory. Despite her experience, Francesca was, after all, used to the winding but far tamer roads of the East Coast. These alpine paths were another matter entirely. A single lapse in attention or miscalculation of a curve could send a motorcycle over the edge, disappearing without a trace into the wilderness. Armed with this grim possibility, the official search was launched. The Hinsdale County Sheriff's Office coordinated quickly with the Civil Air Patrol. For 3 days straight, a single-engine Cessna aircraft flew back and forth in a meticulous grid pattern over the vast mountainous terrain. From 1,000 feet in the air, the spotters aboard scanned endlessly, searching for any sign of movement, a glint of metal, or the unmistakable red gleam of Francesca's bike. The landscape was unforgiving. The contrast of deep green forests and granite peaks made it all too easy for a vehicle, even a bright one, to vanish into the scenery. Simultaneously, ground search teams were mobilized. Deputies loaded into rugged 4x4 vehicles and began patrolling every accessible section of the Alpine Loop and its spidery web of offshoots. Their pace was excruciatingly slow. At each overlook, they stopped to peer through binoculars, inspecting steep drop-offs and ravines for signs of a crash, scraped bark, broken branches, tire tracks sliding into the void. They looked for twisted guardrails or fresh scars in the earth. But the land gave nothing back. No motorcycle, no rider, no clues. After 4 exhausting days, the mountain still held its silence. The search team felt the emotional weight bearing down on them, the frustration of chasing a ghost in a landscape that seemed designed to swallow answers whole. Miller knew it was time to shift strategy. Temporarily, the earth weren't going to speak. Maybe its inhabitants would. He redirected his focus toward the people, those who lived and worked along Francesca's route. He began a thorough canvass of every local business that might have seen her in the days before her disappearance. Gas stations, diners, rustic inns, roadside cabins. Nothing was too obscure to visit. He carried a stack of flyers featuring her radiant selfie and a clear shot of her gleaming red BMW. His first meaningful break came at a small motel just outside Lake City. The owner, George, a weathered man with a slow drawl and an excellent memory, took one look at the flyer and nodded. Yes, he remembered her. He remembered her well. Francesca had checked in for a single night and had left an impression. She had a spark, he said, recalling how she spent nearly 30 minutes chatting in the lobby about her trip, her goals, her love of the open road. But just as Miller was about to leave, George hesitated. "There was something else," he said, his voice lowering. "She told me about a weird guy she ran into earlier that day at the gas station in town. Said he gave her the creeps." According to George, Francesca had brushed it off with a laugh at the time, more curious than fearful, but it had clearly unsettled her. A man had approached her while she was filling up her bike. He didn't just admire the machine, He fixated on it, asked too many questions. Was she traveling alone? Where was she headed? Did she always ride such a nice bike? Francesca had described the man as overly persistent and strangely intense. He was leaning in too close, George recalled her saying, like he wasn't listening to what I said, just waiting to speak again. It had made her uncomfortable, something that hadn't happened anywhere else on her trip. This wasn't just a minor note. For Miller, it was the first concrete deviation from the accident theory, a possible human element, a new path of inquiry. He thanked George and immediately drove into town to visit the gas station in question. The manager on duty was accommodating and allowed Miller to access their surveillance footage from August 22nd. The camera mounted above the forecourt had a wide field of view and recorded in black and white. Though the resolution was mediocre, the footage provided a critical snapshot. There she was. Francesca, dressed in her blue riding jacket, helmet under one arm, standing beside her motorcycle. The tall man approached from the far side of the lot, wearing a stained baseball cap and heavy work boots. Their interaction lasted just under 2 minutes. The footage had no sound, but the body language spoke volumes. Francesca kept a respectful distance, responding but with measured reserve. The man, by contrast, leaned in, gesturing emphatically at her bike, his posture overly familiar. Miller narrowed his eyes. This wasn't a fleeting conversation. It was deliberate, intrusive. He paused the video and took a snapshot of the man's face. A new suspect had emerged. After a few tense minutes on that surveillance footage, the man in the dirty baseball cap finally turned and walked away, heading out of frame. Francesca, wasting no time, finished refueling, swung her leg over her motorcycle, and rode off into the distance. Detective David Miller captured a still from that footage and showed it to a local deputy. The reaction was immediate. The man was recognized not as a stranger, but as someone who drifted through the mountain communities every summer. He was a transient, a seasonal laborer who picked up whatever work he could find during the warmer months. Construction gigs, ranch hands, fence repair. Come winter, he'd vanish south or elsewhere, always avoiding the cold. His name was known to local law enforcement, though he hadn't been on their radar for anything serious in years. A few petty theft charges from a different county dotted his record, but nothing violent. Nothing that would raise red flags. Until now. Miller wasted no time. A BOLO, be on the lookout, was dispatched statewide and soon expanded to neighboring jurisdictions. The alert included a freeze frame from the gas station security footage and a detailed physical description of the man. Medium build, tall, Caucasian, wore scuffed work boots and a fraying flannel shirt. For the first time in days, the investigation had a pulse, a new direction that suggested human involvement rather than a tragic solo accident. For the next 7 days, this man became the epicenter of the search. Could he have followed Francesca after their interaction? Had he seen her vulnerability and decided to act on impulse? Theories multiplied, each darker than the last. The timeline allowed for it. He had motive, means, and opportunity. And then, just as swiftly as the hope had risen, it was dashed. 2 weeks later, a sheriff's deputy in rural Wyoming found the man living in a bunkhouse on a secluded cattle ranch, several hours from the nearest town. He was brought in without resistance, questioned by detectives, and subjected to a full background check. What Miller found was both relieving and frustrating. The man was candid, even surprised. Yes, he remembered the woman with the red motorcycle. He admitted to chatting with her, admired her BMW, and even confessed to being a bit too enthusiastic in their exchange. He claimed to be a die-hard motorcycle enthusiast who rarely got the chance to see a European touring model up close. But that was it. According to him, it had been nothing more than a friendly, if awkward, encounter. More importantly, he had a verifiable, airtight alibi. He had started work at the ranch the day after the gas station sighting. His employer confirmed it. So did his timesheets. The foreman, a no-nonsense man with little patience for dishonesty, had personally signed off on the man's 10-hour shifts for the entire week following Francesca's disappearance. The records matched. He had been over 300 miles away during the critical window of time. With no evidence to the contrary, Miller had no choice but to clear him of suspicion. Just like that, what had seemed like the most promising lead turned into a dead end. The momentum behind the case evaporated. The man returned to his bunkhouse. Francesca remained missing. As September gave way to October, the atmosphere in the San Juan Mountains began to transform. The brilliant yellows and oranges of the aspen trees dimmed, then fell, carpeting the forest floors in rustling layers of decay. The once warm air turned brittle and sharp, and the mountaintops transitioned from light dustings of snow to thick, immovable caps of ice and frost. The first major snowstorm of the season buried the higher elevations, laying down a blanket of white so heavy it silenced even the wind. With that storm, any lingering hope of finding visible evidence, skid marks, debris, the glint of metal in a ravine, was smothered under snowdrifts that would not melt until the following spring. Detective Miller convened a somber meeting with the county sheriff and the head of the regional search and rescue team. They reviewed their progress, or lack thereof, and debated their options. The conclusion, though expected, was no less heartbreaking. Continuing the search through the winter was impossible. The terrain was too dangerous. The likelihood of the results is too low. The decision was made. The active ground search for Francesca Sullivan would be suspended until conditions improved. Miller was the one who had to make the call to the Sullivan family. Eleanor answered, and when Miller delivered the news, the silence on the other end said more than words ever could. He tried to reassure them. The case was not closed. It would remain open, and come spring, they would resume. But everyone understood the subtext. The trail had gone cold. The file, once active, was now just another manila folder in a drawer. Miller placed it there himself, thick with printouts, maps, witness statements, and a long list of dashed hopes. Outside, snowflakes drifted down, settling over the peaks, the trees, and the unanswered questions, burying them in silence. Spring in the San Juan Mountains doesn't arrive with fanfare. It creeps in slowly, melting the snow inch by inch, awakening the land in hesitant stages. By May 2019, the high passes began to clear. Rivers ran high and fast with glacial runoff, carving their way through valleys still lined with remnants of ice. But for the Sullivan family, the changing season brought no relief. Instead, it ignited a fresh wave of frustration. The official stance from the authorities was clear. There would be no reactivation of the search unless new leads surfaced. Manpower was limited. The wilderness is too expansive. Without a defined target area, the effort would be futile. Refusing to accept that her disappearance would become just another cold case, the Sullivans took matters into their own hands. In July, exactly 1 year after Francesca's final message, Mark and Eleanor Sullivan embarked on a cross-country journey of their own. They packed their modest sedan and drove nearly 1,800 miles from their home in Pennsylvania to Lake City, Colorado. But unlike Francesca's hopeful adventure, theirs was driven by desperation and grief. They rented a small motel room at the edge of town and transformed it into an impromptu operations center. It quickly filled with supplies, stacks of printed flyers, boxes of tape and pushpins, maps marked with Francesca's route, and the original search radius. The hum of their portable printer was constant, the air tinged with the scent of fresh toner and stress. Every morning they set out with fresh flyers in hand. Each page bore the same image, Francesca's beaming face, captured in that now infamous selfie, alongside bold, desperate lettering that simply read, "Missing." They traced her original path, road by road, in a vehicle that felt absurdly out of place in such rugged terrain. Where Francesca had once ridden with the wind in her hair, they now inched along narrow curves, the weight of dread clinging to every turn. What once looked like scenic beauty now felt sinister. Every overlook became a vantage point for fear. Every canyon is a possible resting place. They stopped in every town, every isolated store, every gas station, asking the same painful questions again and again. In some places, people welcomed them. Locals remembered the story, offered tea, shared condolences, and even offered to help pass out flyers. In others, they were met with tired eyes and polite indifference. Some seemed vaguely annoyed, as if Francesca's tragedy was an unwelcome ghost that kept resurfacing. A few, though rare, were downright dismissive. Still, the Sullivans pressed on. Each conversation opened a wound, but also reminded them of their mission. Francesca could not be forgotten. She wouldn't become just a name on a poster. And while they scoured the landscape, something else began to stir online. Francesca's story had all the elements of a digital legend in the making: a spirited young woman, an ambitious solo journey, a breathtaking final image frozen in time. It was the kind of narrative that resonated deeply with the online world. Her disappearance soon found a second life across the internet. On motorcycle touring forums, Reddit threads, and true crime message boards, her case evolved into a kind of modern mystery, the details dissected and reinterpreted by an army of anonymous sleuths with an insatiable curiosity. These virtual investigators were not professionals. Most had no training in law enforcement or search and rescue. Yet what they lacked in credentials, they made up for in dedication. Armed with only a Wi-Fi connection and an obsessive drive to solve the unsolvable, they analyzed every crumb of public data. Francesca's final photo, for example, became a touchstone, an image that received more forensic attention than most crime scene evidence. Some users applied astronomical software to determine the exact time of day the photo was taken by measuring the angle of the shadows. Others overlaid geological maps and elevation charts, attempting to triangulate the mountain peaks in the background and identify the exact body of water she had posed in front of. Heated discussions erupted about whether the lake was glacial, man-made, or seasonal runoff. Every pixel was a potential clue. Some theories were entirely plausible. Maybe Francesca had deviated from the intended route and taken an obscure, unpaved road not documented in her original plan. Others delved into darker territory, hypotheses that she had been targeted, possibly for her high-value motorcycle, or worse, that she had been abducted at a remote campsite. More far-fetched ideas surfaced as well, including the suggestion that she had staged her own disappearance to escape her life and start anew under a different identity. In the Sullivan household, Mark became deeply entrenched in these forums. Late at night, long after Eleanor had given in to exhaustion and gone to bed, he would sit alone in the dim glow of his laptop. The light cast harsh shadows across his weary face as he read through thread after thread, following each link, revisiting every theory. He was a silent member, he rarely commented, but he read everything. The experience was torturous and yet strangely comforting. On the one hand, these strangers were keeping Francesca's story alive. They refused to let her fade into obscurity. Their digital community became a bastion against the brutal finality of forgetting. But on the other hand, many of their posts were difficult to endure. Reading graphic speculations about how his daughter might have died, or where her body might be hidden, was a psychological punishment. And yet, he couldn't look away. He never knew when one comment, just one, might contain the overlooked clue. Time continued its march. The Rockies changed their coats. Green turned to gold, then to white. Summer bled into winter and back again. 2 years slipped by, then a third. And just as the case seemed to be frozen in history, a crack of possibility burst through the silence. In late autumn of 2021, a call was placed to the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System. The woman on the other end was a tourist from Ohio, traveling through the Southwest with her husband. She explained that while dining at a small roadside eatery in a remote Arizona town, she had been struck by the waitress who served her. The young woman bore an uncanny resemblance to the photographs of Francesca Sullivan, so much so that it unsettled her. The caller recalled that the waitress was around the right age, had the same build, and most importantly, the same distinctive brown hair. But it wasn't just her appearance. What had lingered in the caller's mind was the woman's expression. There was a sadness in her eyes, something quiet and haunting that didn't seem to fit the otherwise casual environment of the diner. She looked like someone carrying a heavy story. The tip was routed through the appropriate channels, first to the database administrators, then back to the local sheriff's office in Hinsdale County, and finally to the Sullivans themselves. For the first time in years, the family felt the pulse of hope quicken in their veins. Mark and Eleanor tried to remain grounded. They had been through enough false starts to know how quickly hope could curdle into grief. But emotions rarely obey logic. Eleanor caught herself daydreaming, replaying the moment she would see Francesca walk through a doorway. How she would run to her, the embrace, the answers. Mark allowed himself to believe it, even just for a night, that his daughter might still be alive, waiting out there for someone to finally find her. The Arizona Sheriff's Office moved quickly. A deputy was dispatched to the town mentioned in the tip. The diner was easy to locate. It was the only one for miles. A low, squat building with a faded neon sign and a parking lot surrounded by dust and desert scrub. The deputy entered quietly, the bell above the door giving a cheerful chime. He scanned the room and saw her at once. The waitress in question had her hair tied back, a coffee pot in hand, weaving between tables with practiced efficiency. She noticed him too, took a second look as he walked directly toward her. He politely asked if they could speak in private. She blinked, hesitated, then led him to a small office in the back. Inside, he gently laid out the situation. He showed her the missing person flyer, Francesca's face staring back in vibrant color. The woman's eyes lingered on the image, and for a brief moment, the deputy felt something shift in the air. But then she shook her head. She opened her wallet and produced a driver's license. The name wasn't Francesca Sullivan. The birth date was different. Her identity, it turned out, had never been in question. She was a local, a single mother struggling through 2 jobs. The sadness in her eyes wasn't mysterious. It was born of a life lived on the edge of exhaustion. The return call to the Sullivans was short and clinical. The lead was invalid. The waitress wasn't Francesca. Another door closed. The emotional fallout was immediate. Eleanor later said it felt like losing her daughter all over again. The surge of belief, the tentative images of a reunion, the flash of what could be. All of it vanished, leaving behind only that familiar emptiness. The cruel roller coaster had taken them for another ride, and once again, they were left standing in the cold. By 2023, 5 years had passed. Francesca's case wasn't just cold, it was inert. The term cryogenic came to mind. Detective David Miller had retired from the force, his years of tireless effort packed away in cardboard boxes. The thick binder marked Sullivan was passed to a young detective already burdened with newer, more urgent crimes. It was just another cold file on an overloaded desk. The flyers that had once peppered Colorado towns had long since disappeared. Some were bleached pale by years of relentless sun. Others were torn down, replaced with newer pleas for help in other missing cases. The online forums where Mark once spent sleepless nights had gone quiet. The thread dedicated to Francesca, once vibrant with theories and updates, was now buried deep, only occasionally revived by newcomers posting timidly. Any updates on this case? The replies were always the same. Number to the outside world. Francesca Sullivan had become little more than a faded photograph, a digital ghost relegated to the corners of missing persons databases and forgotten message boards. But for her parents, she remained heartbreakingly real. She was everywhere and nowhere all at once, a haunting presence wrapped in silence, suspended in the amber of late August 2018. The pain had changed form over the years. No longer sharp and piercing, it had settled into something more insidious, chronic, dull, and omnipresent. A shadow that never lifted. Their lives continued, but never resumed. Every routine bore the weight of her absence. Every birthday, every holiday, every sunset reminder of her adventurous spirit, only deepening the ache. The not knowing had metastasized into something physical, tightness in the chest, a perpetual tension in their shoulders, headaches from clenching their jaws against the tears. Hope had become a fragile, brittle thing. It lived in them, but it no longer sustained. It barely flickered. The case, officially speaking, was cold, dormant. The leads were gone, the theories exhausted. Even the most dedicated members of the online sleuthing communities had moved on. 6 years had passed, and with them, Francesca's name had slowly slipped from the public consciousness. But beneath the surface of that quiet, something was brewing. Something no detective, no forum, no search team could have predicted. In the late summer of 2024, nature intervened. That season brought with it a monsoon unlike any the American Southwest had seen in decades. Meteorologists watched in awe as a persistent atmospheric river, fed by the remnants of tropical storms drifting northward from the Pacific, parked itself over the Four Corners region. Day after day, skies once famed for their crisp clarity were choked with storm clouds. Torrents of rain pounded the high deserts of northern New Mexico, far more than the land could drink. Dry arroyos became rivers overnight. Dusty creek beds transformed into roaring brown torrents, cutting through canyon walls and dragging everything in their path. The Rio Grande, that ancient river slicing through the heart of New Mexico, began to rise with terrifying speed. What had been a lazy, meandering flow became a monstrous artery of mud-thick water, churning with uprooted trees, crushed debris, and entire slabs of earth. The gorge that cradled the river was assaulted with relentless power. Rock faces eroded. Long-standing log jams snapped loose. Channels shifted. The riverbed was rewritten in a matter of days. The landscape unrecognizable. Locals called it a scouring, a cleansing by floodwaters that spared no corner of the Rio Grande's path. When the rain finally relented and the waters began their slow, muddy retreat, one man decided to see the aftermath for himself. Ben Carter was a river guide and outdoorsman in his early 40s, someone who had spent much of his adult life paddling the twists and bends of the Rio Grande Gorge. He was no stranger to floods or seasonal changes in the water's behavior, but this was something else entirely. What had occurred over the last week was cataclysmic, driven by a mix of professional interest and personal reverence for the river. Carter loaded up his gear and set out to navigate a section of the gorge known as the Taos Box, a remote, sheer-walled corridor famous for both its beauty and its danger. The water was still high, its surface murky and opaque, colored like coffee with too much cream. Debris clogged the usual paths. Entire tree trunks jutted from the flow like broken fingers. But Carter knew the river intimately. He maneuvered with skill, the current testing him, but never overpowering him. For over an hour, he drifted, adjusting course, reading the river's new language. And then he saw it. Near the western bank, nestled awkwardly within a fresh tangle of driftwood and debris, something stood out. A dull, unnatural red flashed between a massive cottonwood trunk and a cluster of jagged stones. In a place untouched by road or footpath, the object made no sense. Carter's pulse quickened. He angled his kayak toward the strange shape, digging hard against the current that wanted to drag him away. As he drew closer, the shape took form. This was no plastic drum or abandoned cooler. The curve was too specific, the angle too engineered. He stopped paddling. He stared. The handlebars emerged first, bent slightly, coated in grime. Next came the rounded top of a fairing, dulled and cracked, but unmistakable in its silhouette. His breath caught in his throat. It was a motorcycle. Most of the frame was still buried under thick layers of mud and waterlogged debris, but what was visible was enough. Red paint, though battered, gleamed dully beneath the grit. This wasn't just wreckage. It was a message sent by the river, and it shouldn't have been there. The geography made that certain. There were no roads, no overlooks, no trails. The nearest access point was miles away and hundreds of feet up. A crash was out of the question. This motorcycle hadn't arrived here by accident. It had been dumped, likely years ago, left to disappear until nature, in her blind fury, decided otherwise. A cold knot formed in Carter's gut. He backed away from the tangle, his hands steady but his mind racing. He scanned the canyon walls, memorizing distinctive rock formations, noting angles and distance. He would need to report this. He couldn't leave it. Paddling hard, he followed the gorge downstream for another 2 miles, finally reaching a stretch wide enough for a weak cell signal to break through. He beached his kayak on a narrow strip of sand and fumbled for his phone. His fingers trembled as he dialed 911. His voice was calm, anchored by experience, but beneath it was a tremor. He told the dispatcher what he had seen, where he had seen it, and why it mattered. He gave precise markers, triangulated by eye and memory. "It's not accessible on foot," he emphasized. "No way anyone hiked it in. You're going to need air support." The call was transferred to the New Mexico State Police. It reached them at shift change, and within the hour, officers were en route to the Manby Hot Springs trailhead, the closest vantage point. They brought high-powered binoculars and scanned the gorge, confirming the sighting. Even from afar, the red glint was unmistakable. Ground retrieval was immediately ruled out. The terrain was too unstable, the river too unpredictable. They needed eyes in the sky. At sunrise the next morning, the steady, thunderous rhythm of rotor blades echoed through the canyon. A black Bell 407 helicopter emerged above the rim, bearing the insignia of the New Mexico State Police in shining gold. Its descent was careful, practiced, pilots adjusting constantly for the erratic winds that spiraled between the cliffs. Below, the gorge waited, silent once more. Aboard the hovering helicopter that swept through the narrowing Rio Grande Gorge, tension crackled in the air. The aircraft carried not just equipment but purpose. On board were a tactical flight officer and a seasoned diver from the New Mexico State Police dive team, both trained for high-risk recoveries in inaccessible terrain. As the Bell 407 helicopter stabilized roughly 50 feet above the roaring river below, its rotors whipped the already turbulent surface into a frothing frenzy. Wind and water merged into chaos. The diver, clad head to toe in a thick black dry suit and weighted for balance, stepped into the open doorway. With practiced calm, he was clipped onto a steel winch cable. A quick nod, and the flight officer began the descent. The diver dropped swiftly, disappearing into the muddy, opaque water, swallowed almost instantly by the silt-laden current. Down below, he worked in near-zero visibility. His movements, invisible to the naked eye, were tracked via waterproof radio by the tactical officer above. With strong hands and careful maneuvering, the diver cleared away packed layers of river mud and pried apart the dense web of waterlogged timber encasing the motorcycle. Each branch had to be wrestled free, each stone shifted without compromising stability. It was like performing surgery beneath a churning sea. After several grueling minutes, he finally had access to enough of the frame to loop the lifting straps into position. He locked them in place around the strongest parts of the chassis and handlebars, ensuring the load would remain stable during the ascent. He gave a short, coded signal into his mic. Above, the helicopter's engine roared with fresh power. The steel cables drew tight. The load resisted at first, held down by the vacuum of deep mud and years of compression. Then, with a slow, gurgling wrench, it broke free. From the murky depths emerged a mangled and ghostly form, a mud-caked motorcycle, trailing weeds and river sludge from its every crevice. It hung beneath the aircraft like an artifact dredged from a sunken civilization, its once glossy red paint now dulled and gouged by time and river rock. And yet there was no doubt. This was the same machine from that final, joyful photo of Francesca Sullivan. The BMW G310R she had ridden proudly into the wilderness now looked like a corpse pulled from a battlefield. The helicopter banked slowly, cradling its strange cargo between canyon walls. In the distance, the steel ribbon of the Rio Grande Gorge Bridge arched gracefully over the chasm, oblivious to the long-buried secret now surfacing beneath it. Roughly a mile downriver, the helicopter descended toward a wide sandbar recently exposed by the retreating floodwaters. It was the only flat, accessible stretch for miles. There, a waiting team of state police officers and a mobile crime scene unit stood ready. The moment the aircraft touched down and the diver unhooked the cables, the officers closed in. Every inch of the motorcycle was coated in a thick mixture of algae, silt, and decaying organic matter. The first priority was identification. An officer knelt by the front fork, uncapping a bottle of water and soaking a rag. With meticulous care, he wiped the grime from the steering head, revealing a narrow silver plate. Stamped on the plate was a sequence of letters and numbers, the vehicle identification number. He read it aloud, voice steady, and another officer relayed it over a portable radio to the State Police Communications Center. As they waited for confirmation, the only sounds were the gentle lap of river water and the subtle crackle of the radio's static. Moments later, a reply came through, sharp and clear, edged with audible surprise. The VIN was a confirmed match, a 2016 BMW G310R, registered to Francesca Sullivan of Pennsylvania. But that wasn't all. The dispatcher's tone shifted, growing clipped and urgent. The motorcycle was tied to an open missing person case, one that had gone cold for 6 long years. Filed originally by the Hinsdale County Sheriff's Office in Colorado, it had never been closed. Now that dormant case had burst to life again, resurrected by a flood hundreds of miles from where it began. The officers stood in stunned silence. This was no coincidence, no random disposal. This was a piece of history, a mystery given shape once more. They looked from the mud-caked motorcycle toward the distant gorge rim, trying to absorb what had just happened. News of the find spread quickly through official channels, triggering an immediate reclassification of the case. It now belonged to New Mexico, under the jurisdiction of the State Police Criminal Investigations Bureau. The case was assigned to Detective Mateo Reyes, a deliberate and methodical investigator known for handling complex, emotionally fraught investigations. Cold cases weren't just about forensic puzzles to him. They were about long-suffering families and the lingering wounds of unanswered grief. The file opened on his desk with a single image. The recovered motorcycle, glistening wet, half covered in silt, laid out on a tarp beside the riverbank. His first call was not to the media or even his superiors. It was to the man who had carried this case for years. David Miller, now retired, picked up the phone in his quiet Colorado suburb. When Reyes introduced himself and mentioned Francesca's name, there was a pause on the line, a silence born not of confusion, but of weight. Then Reyes shared the details. As Miller listened, he closed his eyes. The words seemed surreal. For years he had obsessed over the Sullivan case, convinced it wasn't just a wilderness accident, that there was more beneath the surface, something buried too deep to reach. The revelation that her bike had been found so far from Colorado confirmed a suspicion he'd never been able to shake. He told Reyes he would send his personal case notes immediately. Not the formal reports, but his raw files, scribbled theories, potential connections, lists of odd sightings, everything. "You're going to need all of it," he said. The second call Reyes had to make was exponentially harder. He dialed the number on file for the Sullivan residence. Mark Sullivan answered. Reyes introduced himself gently, identifying his department and explaining that there had been a major development. Francesca's motorcycle had been recovered, he said, his voice calm, compassionate, practiced. There was no explosion of emotion on the other end, just silence. Reyes could hear Eleanor's breath catch in the background, an involuntary, gasping intake like someone stepping into icy water. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, quietly, Reyes shared the details. The massive storm, the flooding, the kayaker, the impossible location of the bike in northern New Mexico. He made it clear that this wasn't closure, not yet. But it was something. A door long thought sealed had swung open. The effect on the Sullivans was seismic. For 6 years, they had lived in limbo, balanced between hope and despair. A part of them had always dreamed, irrationally maybe, that Francesca had left of her own volition, that somewhere, somehow, she was living under a new name, safe and free. That dream evaporated with Reyes's call. This wasn't a disappearance. This was concealment, and someone had gone to great lengths to ensure she stayed hidden. A renewed surge of anguish swept through the Sullivan family, tangled with something even darker, an emerging sense of fear. The discovery of Francesca's motorcycle didn't close the case. It opened a door to a more ominous reality. What they had once accepted as a tragic accident was beginning to look more like a concealed crime. As emotional shockwaves rippled through their world, the physical evidence embarked on a journey of its own. The red BMW, its surfaces still slick with river muck, was secured onto a flatbed truck under tight security. Accompanied by a police convoy, it made the hours-long drive to the New Mexico State Police Crime Laboratory located in Santa Fe. This facility, sterile and floodlit, sat miles away from the raw wilderness of the Rio Grande Gorge. Here, the machine, once a symbol of freedom, would be dissected with surgical precision, stripped of its secrets by science. The first expert to examine the battered motorcycle was Dr. Lucas Harrow, a forensic metallurgist with over 2 decades of experience deciphering the decay of metals. His role was crucial. He would determine how long the motorcycle had actually spent underwater. For nearly 2 full days, Harrow scrutinized every surface. Under a series of high-intensity lamps and using specialized microscopes, he documented corrosion patterns, scraped microsamples from the brake discs, and studied oxidation rates on various metals. His findings, when delivered to Detective Reyes, were nothing short of earth-shattering. In his comprehensive report, Harrow concluded that the motorcycle could not have been submerged in the Rio Grande for the 6 years since Francesca's disappearance. The surface rust was evident, but lacked the depth and severity typical of prolonged aquatic exposure. If the bike had truly been underwater since 2018, there would be aggressive, widespread corrosion, deep pitting on untreated metals, especially the drive chain and exposed bolts. But those telltale signs were missing. What the metallurgist did find was a more recent timeline of environmental impact. The pattern and distribution of corrosion suggested submersion for only a single cycle, perhaps a year, and possibly as little as 6 to 8 months. Further backing this claim were biological samples scraped from inside the machine's crevices, algae and microbial growth consistent with a short-lived bloom, not the layered residue expected after multiple seasons of freeze and thaw. The implications struck Reyes like a blow. The motorcycle had only entered the river recently, long after Francesca had vanished. The question no one had asked before now loomed large. Where had the bike been kept for those missing 5 years? That bombshell was still reverberating when another arrived from the vehicle reconstruction lab. A second team, this one composed of forensic engineers and crash analysts, had examined the bike's physical damage in exhaustive detail. They were looking for indicators of a crash, abrasions, bends, dents, and deformations that told a story without words. Their findings contradicted every previous assumption. There were no lateral scrapes, no gravel gouges on the side panels or engine casings. The fairings weren't shredded, Nor were the handlebars bent as they would be in a high-speed fall. Instead, the damage was vertical, like a crushing weight had come down evenly from above. The aluminum frame showed a distinct downward arc. The suspension system was completely compressed, and the internal seals were blown apart. The wheels had buckled under a uniform shock. Most strikingly, the engine housing bore stress fractures radiating outward like ripples from an impact point. The lab's conclusion was definitive and chilling. The motorcycle had not been in an accident. It had not been dropped from a trailer or tipped over in a garage. The damage, they asserted, was highly consistent with a vertical free fall, a long drop onto water which softened the initial strike, followed by a destructive impact with submerged rocks or debris. Detective Reyes absorbed this in silence, then reached for the map of the recovery site, less than a quarter-mile upstream from where the kayaker had discovered the bike. The Rio Grande Gorge Bridge spanned the canyon. Towering 650 feet above the riverbed, it was an iconic structure, and now, quite possibly, a crime scene. He didn't need the lab report to confirm what his gut already screamed. Francesca's motorcycle had not been abandoned gently. It had been disposed of with intention and calculation. Someone had taken that bike, kept it hidden for years, then driven it onto the bridge under the cover of night and hurled it into the darkness below. The implications forced a fundamental shift in the investigation's direction. In the NMSP command center, Reyes erased the old working theory from the whiteboard. Accidental crash, Colorado, 2018. It was no longer relevant. That narrative was a distraction, a shadow they had chased for years. Now he began reconstructing the real timeline. Francesca vanished in late August 2018. Her motorcycle did not. It had remained out of sight, under someone's control, until it was dumped into the Rio Grande sometime in late 2023 or early 2024. The motive for this sudden disposal? Unclear. But the act itself was deliberate and sophisticated. Reyes submitted formal documentation to the State Attorney General's office requesting a reclassification of the case. Within days, the bureaucratic process concluded. The disappearance of Francesca Sullivan was no longer a cold missing persons case. It was an open homicide investigation. With the new classification came new jurisdictional coordination. What had once been Colorado's haunting mystery was now New Mexico's active crime. And the red motorcycle, recovered from the river like a relic of a submerged lie, became the focal point of a sprawling investigation. The bike was placed on a plastic containment sheet in the forensic garage. Gloves were donned, cameras readied. Technicians began a full teardown, removing the fairings, isolating components, and documenting every centimeter of the frame. Every wire was traced. Every seam was checked for tampering. They weren't looking for what was obvious. They were searching for anomalies, for hidden things. Most traces would have been obliterated by time and water, but there was still hope. On the third day of the inspection, a young technician named Maya Lopez was assigned to dismantle the intake system. She began by carefully removing the fuel tank, exposing the airbox underneath, a sealed compartment critical for feeding clean air into the engine. The airbox was a uniquely sheltered part of the bike. Tucked away from direct exposure, it could have escaped the worst of the water damage. When she popped the cover open, something caught her eye, lodged next to the paper air filter, barely visible in the shadows. It was not natural, not plant matter or silt. Reaching in with tweezers, she gently extracted a tightly folded object. Pale, fragile, it was a piece of paper, weathered but unmistakably man-made. Carefully, she placed it in an evidence envelope and alerted the lead technician. The garage fell silent as word spread. Whatever the paper contained, it had survived both the elements and time itself, preserved in the last place anyone thought to look. It was faded and water-stained around the edges, yet astonishingly, the core remained legible. The technician unfolded it with care. It was clearly a torn piece from a larger page, the type of thin, glossy sheet used in old-fashioned road atlases. Across its surface ran faint red and blue lines denoting state highways and minor county roads. The typography, unmistakably map-based, whispered a story long forgotten. The fragment depicted a remote and largely uninhabited area in northern New Mexico, just a 2-hour drive south of the Rio Grande Gorge. Among the handful of towns printed on the map, one was faintly circled in blue pen. This unassuming mark jolted the investigative team. Finally, they had a tangible clue, a geographical anchor for a narrative that had floated untethered for too long. It felt like a whisper from the past, preserved in the dark, protected heart of the motorcycle's airbox. But the question lingered like a shadow. Why was it there? Had Francesca herself torn that map fragment and tucked it away for quick reference during her ride? Or had it been placed there by someone else? Someone with darker intentions. The idea that the map had belonged to her killer chilled the room. Perhaps he had marked that location as significant. Maybe as a hiding spot, a trophy stash, or worse. Reyes stood at his whiteboard, the theories coalescing. It was now clear. Francesca had not disappeared in Colorado. Her cheerful message from the mountain pass wasn't her final stop. She had crossed into New Mexico, following the road outlined on her map, heading deeper into isolation. Somewhere in that sun-baked landscape, she had encountered someone who had no intention of letting her continue. The working theory sharpened to a terrifying clarity. Francesca was intercepted, likely murdered. Her red motorcycle, too distinctive to easily dispose of, had been hidden away. Kept perhaps as a twisted memento or left somewhere remote to be forgotten. But in 2023 or early 2024, that secret had become too dangerous. Someone had transported the bike to the Rio Grande Gorge Bridge and, under the cover of night, hurled it into the abyss, hoping nature would swallow it whole. Now, with the map as their compass, the investigation turned its full attention to that pinpointed region in northern New Mexico. Reyes launched a coordinated operation, enlisting local sheriff's departments, search and rescue teams, and even volunteer hikers who knew the landscape intimately. For weeks, they combed the area methodically. The terrain was unforgiving. Instead of the alpine beauty of Colorado, this was harsh desert country. A mosaic of dry arroyos, thorny sagebrush, piñon pines, and crumbling mesas. The teams walked tight grids, scouring every inch for the smallest anomaly. A scrap of cloth, a rusted zipper, a shallow depression in the earth. They climbed into long-abandoned ranch houses, dropped into ravines, and peered under rock overhangs where shadows pooled like secrets. They spoke with every remaining resident in the circled town, ranchers, shopkeepers, old-timers who remembered distant summers. They showed Francesca's photo to anyone who would look. Most shook their heads, eyes clouded with the passage of time. To them, the summer of 2018 was ancient history. A lone motorcyclist might have passed through, but if she had, her memory had long since vanished into the dust. Despite their thoroughness, the search turned up nothing. The land kept its silence, and eventually, reluctantly, the official operation was suspended again. Reyes was frustrated but not defeated. The answers, he believed, were still buried out there. Then, weeks later, another miracle surfaced. A geology professor from the University of New Mexico, conducting flood impact research, noticed something strange in the exposed layers of sediment lining the gorge's banks. A glint of white, sharp-edged and oddly shaped. Too uniform to be a natural object. She dug gently with her rock hammer, and her breath caught. It was a bone. Reyes returned with a team from the office of the medical investigator. What followed was not just an investigation, but an archaeological dig. Every scoop of dirt was carefully screened. Slowly, the compacted soil yielded human remains, partial, scattered, but unquestionably human. Back in Santa Fe, the remains were examined in a sterile lab. A forensic anthropologist took meticulous measurements. The bones belonged to a woman in her late 20s, roughly 5 feet 6 inches to 5 feet 8 inches tall. The right clavicle held the key, a raised callus, the unmistakable signature of a healed fracture. The detail matched Francesca's medical history exactly. At 16, she'd broken her collarbone in a bicycling accident. The location, angle, and extent of the healing were identical. With that match, the tentative became certain. The report was submitted with a solemn finality, a presumptive identification with an extremely high degree of medical certainty. Francesca Sullivan had been found. The girl who once stood laughing in the mountain sunlight was now reduced to a forensic profile. The landscape had finally yielded her body, but not her cause of death. There were no signs of blunt force trauma, no bullet wounds, and no fractures suggestive of violence. Time and the elements had erased that part of her story. The bones offered no answers to the lingering question that now haunted the case. How had she died? Reyes now faced a new challenge. Though the mystery had partially unraveled, the threads that remained were more sinister. Someone had killed Francesca and hidden her body for years. Someone had destroyed evidence by launching her motorcycle into the Rio Grande. And someone, perhaps, was still out there, watching from afar, hoping the past would stay buried. But the past, like the river, was beginning to carve its way to the surface. The fragmented state of the remains offered no definitive evidence to determine how Francesca died. There were no signs of gunshot wounds, no sharp force trauma, and no indications of physical violence readily visible on the bones. Yet the context, the hidden body, the concealed motorcycle, and the passage of time, all pointed undeniably toward foul play. The state medical examiner could not identify the specific method, but the circumstances allowed for only one conclusion: homicide. This declaration, while offering an answer long denied, devastated the Sullivan family. The unbearable ambiguity of 6 years had finally ended, but what replaced it was a brutal certainty. Their daughter had been taken from them violently. Grief, once suspended in the limbo of hope, now sank into the heavy finality of loss. Francesca's case, closed only in name, remains unsolved. Her killer is unknown. Her final moments are locked in silence, buried in the harsh and silent desert. The file remains active, waiting for a new lead, a confession, or the smallest crack in a wall of silence that has endured for too long.